Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay here. I wanted to talk a little bit about a professional wrestler who unfortunately has passed away. He passed away a couple of days ago. As a matter of fact, on the 21st of August. But I didn't get a chance to really speak about him because we were so busy, so caught up in the death of Terry Funk and the death of Bray Wyatt in these past couple of days. But he was somebody that I really wanted to touch on because he was somebody that I'm learning a tremendous amount about. A lot of times when I talk about professional wrestlers, I know a lot about them. I have fond memories of them when I talk about their lives in retrospective. But when it comes to this individual, Abe Jacobs, aka uh, Red Pimpero, know I knew nothing about him. But through the internet and through watching old footage on YouTube, I'm beginning to learn. He was the master. He was in the age of 96 years old. He passed away in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's originally a native of of the country of New Zealand, which is what makes him the master of the Kiwi roll. Now, what is the Kiwi roll? Kiwi roll was obviously his finishing maneuver that was derived from amateur wrestling as an amateur wrestling takedown. And that's where his career begins. His career begins in New Zealand as a child, listening to wrestling on the radio in the mid 1940s. Obviously, you'd be listening to the biggest star of the late 1940s, early 1950s, Gorgeous George, in a match between on the radio in a match between Gorgeous George and George Temple. So this gets him interested in weightlifting and wrestling, and he starts training, and he nearly makes it to the 1956 Olympics, where he is unfortunately defeated. From there, he travels to Washington D.C. in 1958. He makes his wrestling debut in the Capital Wrestling Corporation. Now, many people will say, "Well, what is the Capital Wrestling Corporation?" The Capital Wrestling Corporation, for anybody that doesn't know, and they should know this if they're up on their wrestling history, is the original name of what we today call World Wrestling Entertainment, or the WWE. When the WWE started in 1950, some say two, some say three, and that was the original name. That was the name that Vince McMahon Sr. and Toots Mondt gave to the promotion because that's where they did their TV tapings in Washington, D.C. So, anyway, this guy, Abe Jacobs, makes his way down there in 1958 and immediately has a, a, uh, a billing, a moniker, the Jewish heavyweight champion. Now, we've talked about this before. We talked about this in regards to the WWF era, post 1965. That Vince McMahon pushes, or Vince McMahon Sr. pushed ethnic baby faces, baby faces that would cater to certain demographics of people. Now, since Abe Jacobs, although he was from New Zealand, he was of Jewish descent. So obviously, hearing this and a large Jewish population in the Northeast, where Vince McMahon Sr. is promoting Capital Wrestling, he says, "Okay, we're gonna make him the Jewish champion. We already have, somebody for the Hispanics, Antonino Rocca, Miguel Perez, who were big time um, acts in the territory at that time. Because even before Vince Sr., even before the early 50s, Vince Sr., knew the New York territory. Vince Sr. and his father, Jess McMahon, had always done this. This is something that was always done. This was a strategy that they had always used. I mean, who was the biggest star? Think back, guys, to who was the biggest star in professional wrestling back in the 1930s. It was handsome Jim Londos, a Greek American, the golden Greek American or Greek, a person of Greek descent, basically the golden Greek, the original golden Greek before John Tolos. So ethnic baby faces had always been a thing, even further back than even handsome Jim Londos. Think back to Daniel L. Mahoney, who won the NWA Heavyweight Championship out of Boston in in the 1930s against Dick Schickett. So they'd always kind of figured out that if you have a certain ethnic, high concentration of a certain ethnicity in an area, putting the belt on him would bring more people of that specific ethnicity to the matches. Um, whether it's the Hispanics and the Italians for Raka, whether it's the Greeks for Londos, whether it's the Irish for Daniel Mahoney, or the Italians for Bruno, or the Puerto Ricans for Pedro Morales, or the Black people for, say, Ernie the Big Cat Ladd, or Bobo Brazil, or Luther Lindsay. This was a strategy used in wrestling since forever. And this is a strategy that McMahon's employed. Hell, they did the exact same thing when they promoted the first black heavyweight champion in boxing in 1915 in Cuba when they promoted the Jack Johnson Jess Willard fight. So the McMahons were well aware that using Abe Jacobs's Jewish heritage would be to their advantage. But even more so here, because this is right after World War II. And during the golden age of professional wrestling, when television was first coming out, some of the greatest heels, some of the greatest bad guys on TV in professional wrestling were former Nazis. We talked before about Fritz von Erich, how Fritz von Erich became a Nazi sympathizer when he was working in Calgary. People know about Hans Schmidt, who was probably the most successful Nazi sympathizer of that era. People know about and people know about this guy, Karl von Hess. So seeing as though Abe Jacobs was built as the Jewish champion, who's his natural enemy? Who's his natural adversary? Especially after what happened um, during World War II, the Holocaust, unfortunately. His natural enemy, his natural adversary, is a Nazi. So in 1959, they book him versus Karl von Hess in Madison Square Garden. And Hess's promo during in the lead up to this match draws tremendous controversy from the audience because he says to Abe Jacobs, "You better say a kiddush for your family." To the announcer, Ray, who was Ray Morgan, who was the original announcer for Capital Wrestling, who Vince McMahon Jr. replaced. He says that to the announcer, right? And this this will be controversial today, but this is even more This would be just as controversial back then because the Holocaust is still fresh in people's mind. Um, World War II had just ended in the 1940s, and here we are in 1959. It's a little over 10 years, you know what I mean? But it's still fresh in people's minds, and for him to say something like this was tremendously shocking. But anyway, of course, it's professional wrestling. It's hype. It's supposed to do that, and they have the match, and um, Abe Jacobs wins. From there, in 1960, right, he has the first match with another guy who will become a legend in professional wrestling, the living legend of professional wrestling, Bruno Sammartino. Now, Bruno Sammartino, this was his first time in the New York territory. Obviously, came in with great fanfare. He body slammed Haystacks Calhoun in Madison Square Garden, right? He was already known in some of the areas. Not really in New York, he really wasn't known, but in Pittsburgh, he was known on the local radio stations as being a weightlifter. Not really as a wrestler, but as a weightlifter, you know, which is also something that Abe Jacobs had his background. So there's a lot of fanfare around Bruno. Of course, many people know the story of what happened to Bruno during his first run, how there was a power struggle over New York. Cola Coriani, another promoter, attempted to basically take the territory away from Vince Sr., the New York territory, and started promoting parallel to Vince Sr. and almost put it was an interpromotional war. It was like a war for New York. And basically Bruno Sammartino sided with Cola Coriani in that interpromotional war between Coliani and McMahon, and McMahon won, and he blacklisted Bruno Sammartino, kicked him out of the promotion, and even when Bruno tried to go to other territories, like he tried to go to St. Louis, he tried to go to San Francisco, and none of the other promoters in the United States would deal with him. This is why he had to go to Toronto for Frank Tunney's promotion. You know what I mean? And then, later on, when he's drawn tremendous crowds in Toronto for Frank Tunney, Vince sees him. Vince Senior sees that he's doing tremendous business with the Italian population in Toronto, and he's like, "Hey, there's a lot of Italians in Toronto that Bruno's drawing with. Imagine how much more money he could draw if he came back to New York." So he hasn't come back to New York, and Bruno has the condition that he'll only come back to New York if he wins the belt, and that's when he wins the belt against Nature Boy Buddy Rogers in '63 in the Garden, and we're off to the races. Bruno has his his 9-year run, the most amazing run in the history of professional wrestling with the championship, and he becomes the face of the New York territory. But uh, this match with Abe Jacobs was the first match he ever had in his first run. Also in the early '60s, speaking of another guy who Abe Jacobs had um, one of his first matches with, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers in Sunnyside Gardens in Queens. Now, Sunnyside Gardens is interesting because this match, this was 1958. This was for the United States Heavyweight Championship. This was before um, uh, Rogers won the title in 1961 from Pat O'Connor, another New Zealander, at Kaminsky Park. He was just U.S. champion. He and Abe Jacobs had a lot of U.S. title U.S. title matches with one another. You know, but Sunnyside, Queens is interesting because speaking of promoters that tried to run against Vince McMahon in New York, one of the promoters that tried to run against him in New York was Jim Crockett. And after Abe Jacobs leaves um, the New York territory, he heads down to the Crockett territory, and it's in the Crockett territory that he becomes a legend. He teams up with Don Curtis, and they win the NWA World Tag Team Championships. And in the Crockett territory, they hook him up as a tag team wrestler because he's kind of on the small side, and that was Jim Crockett Senior's specialty was tag team wrestling. Before George Scott came to the promotion in the 70s, Crockett, the Crockett Promotions was well known as a tag team territory. You know, you had the Kentuckians, you had George Becker, Johnny Weaver, Johnny Valentine, all guys who Abe Jacobs himself teamed with. In Florida, um, he won the championships, the tag team championships. In LA, he won the tag team championships with Haystacks Calhoun. He teamed with Luther Lindsay. He teamed with Man Mountain Mike. He teamed with Klondike Bill. All over the country, as Crockett was promoting him, he was going to all the other territories, winning tag team championships. Now he goes overseas. Interestingly, overseas, he goes to South Africa. Now, in South Africa, they're hyping up his match. Now he forgets the name of the wrestler that he's supposed to wrestle. And this causes almost a riot in South Africa to the point where people are chasing him out of the country, telling him, "Go home, Yankee, go home, Yankee." Right? He tours all over the world, Australia, New Zealand. He even has a match in the mid 60s with Pat O'Connor, who was his basically his inspiration, a man from his native country that inspired him to become a wrestler. So he's touring all around the world, winning all these tag team championships. And then in the 1970s, he returns back to the Crockett territory. And guess what, guys? Just like he did with Bruno Sammartino, in 1974, when the Nature Boy when the Nature Boy, not Buddy Rogers, when the Nature Boy Ric Flair um, comes to the Crockett territory from the AWA, right? It's like his second year because, like I said, when they moved George Scott into the territory, George Scott changed the territory basically. He changed it from a tag team territory to uh, um, a singles territory. Brought in Wahoo McDaniel, brought in Ricky Steamboat, brought in Ric Flair, and Ric Flair was his greatest creation, basically, because he gave Ric Flair his gimmick. Ric Flair, when he was in the AWA, he was rambling Rickus Rhodes. He was 200 and something, 200 plus pounds. He was not getting over. He was trying to be like another Dusty Rhodes because he grew up watching Dusty Rhodes, and when Dusty would make those stops over in Minnesota, and he wasn't getting over. But in '74, George Scott brings him in to the Carolinas, and he gets over. And Abe Jacobs had his first match, the first match with the Nature Boy Ric Flair, the man who owns the Carolinas. I mean, Ric Flair is so synonymous with the Carolinas that the congresswoman from the Carolinas, when she got up and she gave her speech, what did she do? What did she say? Woo. You know what I mean? Rick, just like how they say the Crusher is the man that made Milwaukee famous. Well, Ric Flair is the man that made Charlotte, North Carolina famous. So Abe does that. Abe Jacobs also wrestles David Von Erich. The famous picture on Wikipedia is a picture of David Von Erich pinning uh, Abe Jacobs. So He stays in the business until like 1976. Then he retires and he becomes a postman. And finally, a couple of days ago, he passed away. You know what I mean? Condolences to his family at 96 years old. You know what I mean? His So I have fun making this video. I have fun learning a lot about his life. When it comes to the golden era of professional wrestling, not that the one I call the golden era. I call the golden era the 80s and 90s because that's the second boom period. But with the first boom period, I enjoy learning about that period because like you don't really hear about those guys. You know what I mean? The guys like Abe Jacobs, the guys like Hans Schmidt, the guys like the French Angel, right? Lou Thez, Vern Gagne, Johnny Weaver. Of course, Gorgeous George. People know about Gorgeous George because his cameos on Lucy, his cameos all over, and he was the biggest star of that era. Packing out the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto in 1950, in the early 1950s against Whipper Billy Watson. You know what I mean? So I enjoy that era because, like I said, you never hear about that era. You hear about the golden era of our era, right? The national expansion of the WWE or F at that time, or um, and the Attitude Era. You know what I mean? Of the late '90s. But when it comes to the '50s, the early age of television, that era, man, I would love to see more documentaries on the women of that era. Billy Wolf's troupe, right? Cora Combs, Mae Young when she was in her prime, Moolah when she was in her prime, uh, Betty Gable when she was in her prime, Judy Martin, Penny Banner, those uh, uh, those girls. I mean, of course, Rocka, Ricky Starr. We don't the 1950s, man. I would love for WWE to somehow get a hold of this footage and show like the early episodes of Wrestling at the Chase or um, the Fritz Kuhn produced Wrestling in Chicago, Wrestling at the Marigold Arena from 1956 to 19 from 1951 to 1957, right? On the Dumont Network, or the match that Jackie Gleason had against what was it? Not Al Costello. Um, the match that Jackie Gleason had against Lou Albano and his partner Tony Altamore when they were the Sicilians. You know that early era of wrestling, man. I'm so intrigued by that, man. You know what I mean? Because like you never hear about it, never ever. Those old timers. Even the 30s, man. Like the original AWA in Boston, Paul Bowser's territory. Like I said, Handsome Jim Londos and Dick Schickett from like 1935. Gus Sonnenberg. Gus Sonnenberg is an interesting one because he was one of the first crossover athletes to cross over from football to professional wrestling. Um, you know, Primo Carnero's matches. Joe Louis had some matches after he retired. You know what I mean? But anyway, this is way off topic. Rest in peace to Abe uh, Jacobs, master of the Kiwi roll. And I was learning about what's the Kiwi roll, but obviously Kiwi is a slang for New Zealander. And that's the thing too. New Zealand and Australia. He wrestled there. You never really hear about New Zealand and Australia, and it's funny because New Zealand and Australia. I mean, not New Zealand, but Australia was the home of the original WCW. What do I mean by that? When Jim Barnett who was Jim Barnett was instrumental in that era in the mass wrestling at the Marigold Arena, and he was promoting alongside Fritz Kuhn. He was part of Fritz Kuhn's promotion. Then he starts promoting in Indiana with Dick the Bruiser's territory. Then he gets chased out of the United States and he goes down to Australia to promote, and he starts up WCW. Then the war for Georgia happens in the mid 70s when Ray Gunkel dies, and the owners of the Georgia territory, like Jerry Oates and Ole Anderson and Paul Jones, which is another Paul Jones, Georgia Championship Wrestling was another promotion that Abe Jacobs wrestled in. They have the war with Ray Gunkel's wife, Ann Gunkel. She starts up All South Wrestling. They have to bring in Bill Watts and Jerry Jarrett to save the territory in the mid 70s. And they bring back Jim Barnett, and Jim Barnett, when they want to suggest the name for the Georgia Championship Wrestling show because they want to expand, they started expanding in Detroit. They started expanding in Ohio, especially in Ohio because Ohio was basically a dead territory. At that time, Johnny Doyle, who was the promoter in Ohio, basically killed the territory. Detroit was kind of dead too because the Sheik had had too many bloodbaths with Bobo Brazil, and and um, and basically killed the town. But they want Georgia Championship Wrestling. The owners of Georgia Championship Wrestling, when they got it back from Ann Gunkel, and they won the war in Georgia, they wanted to expand it nationally, and they needed a name for it. And in Australia, Jim Barnett had been promoting World Championship Wrestling, so he suggested, "What about World Championship Wrestling?" And that became the name of the TV show for Georgia. Then Crockett buys the McMahon buys Georgia and Black Saturday, sells it to Crockett. That still remains the name. And then when Crockett sells it to Turner in 1988, that becomes the name of the promotion. So that's the origins of WCW. So the original WCW was in Australia. So when it comes to New Zealand, all I know about really New Zealand wrestling is the New Zealand Wrestling Union, which Al Costello wrestled in. One of the Kangaroos, Al Costello, wrestled in. And the fact that allegedly tag team matches started in Australia because the original gimmick for tag team matches were called Australian rules matches. You know what I mean? So I would love to learn about more about professional wrestling down there. I had no idea Pat O'Connor was even a New Zealander. So, and what is Kiwi? And Kiwi obviously refers to New Zealand. So here you have this New Zealand Jewish guy that becomes this great professional wrestler, a journeyman. And unfortunately, because he was a journeyman, he never really had a home. You know, like I said, wrestlers that had homes that they became synonymous with that territory, like Jerry Lawler in Memphis, or Fritz Von Erich in Dallas, or Bill Watts in Oklahoma, or Danny Hodge in Oklahoma, or uh, Killer Kowalski or Gorilla Monsoon in New York, or Killer Kowalski in Boston, Gorilla Monsoon in New York, uh, or even Bruno in Pittsburgh. You know, they had a home there. You know what I mean? They had a stake there. But Journeyman, they went around here and they went around there. And because he was more of a tag team guy, he doesn't really get the recognition he deserves. But anyway, rest in peace to him. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next videos coming.